I have always been convinced that a legal investigation of the corona pandemic is key to everything. And I am now even more convinced of this. After all, only the monster's terrifying fear of such a legal investigation explains why they used almost ridiculously excessive fear-mongering in order to make us believe that a harmless illness was a deadly pandemic. And only this explains why they excessively demonized anyone and everyone who even dared question the measures and the pandemic. Or even worse, who used sound reasoning, real science, and common sense to show that the pandemic was nothing but deadly and destructive nonsense, if not insanity. And only their fear explains why they literally went ballistic in order to put me out of business, as I am now explaining in great detail in my criminal complaint, which I've just published. It has already brought forth some very telling reactions from the so-called controlled opposition, but I'll talk about that later. This complaint, by the way, has also been sent to the German Supreme Court in order to let them know my side of the story beyond the usual legal mumble-jumble. That is, the truth as evident from the content of the prosecution's file and the witness's testimony. And we have also let them know that we have published this criminal complaint because this is a matter of public concern, as the Göttingen judiciary, as a result of their own criminal behavior, has already been covered, not very flatteringly, by the New York Times a few years ago and by CBS's 60 Minutes format a couple of months ago. Well, in the meantime, I've decided that I'll not just communicate with you one-on-one in writing. Yes, sure, I'll do that, and I love that, but to refer to some of the things you inform me about in my statements, too. There is lots of stuff that I believe should be made public. I'm sure much of it has already been brought to your attention, but maybe not. I'll start by brushing up on our knowledge about the pandemic. I'll explain once again, this time by way of quoting some of the things you're telling me, how a perfectly harmless illness that could have easily been treated by using readily available medication that has long been proven to be effective was turned into a deadly pandemic by the global financial, military, pharmaceutical, digital, etc., complex, who not only ignored such medication, but deliberately prohibited its use to both make money and kill and maim. But I'll also use the info you sent me to show how, despite all this, everywhere, all over the world, efforts to shine the bright light of truth on what really happened are gaining ground faster and faster and faster and cannot be controlled anymore. Let me start by referring to some quotes from a book that was mentioned in one of the letters I got from one of you, a book whose title is The Predators versus the People, the Big Picture of the 500-Year Secret War Against Humanity, by an author by the name, I think he's Dutch, Moivis T. Bayen. Copies of excerpts from this book were sent to me, as I said, by one of you. Bayen called the above-mentioned criminal conglomerate of the financial, pharmaceutical, military, etc. industry a global mafia, or short, GLAFIA. I continue to call them monsters because I believe that it is important to constantly remind ourselves that we're dealing with psychopaths who lack any human quality, in particular empathy. Do not forget what they have done and continue to do. On page 129, he quotes from a speech, Bayen quotes from a speech RFK Jr. gave at the biggest ever rally held in Berlin. And Kennedy said there, "The pandemic is a crisis of convenience for the elite who are dictating these policies. It gives them the ability to obliterate the middle class, to destroy the institutions of democracy, to shift all of our wealth to a handful of billionaires while impoverishing the rest of us." Then Bayen explains how a protection racket is an old mafia trick to steal not simply by robbing a victim, but through a deception. The deception starts with a mafia-made problem, a bogeyman, so designed that the potential victim will react with fear and ask for a mafia-provided solution, protection, thus becoming a client. So Glavia staged wars, state terrorism, fake diseases, and the CO2-caused global warming hoax are all protection rackets in his view. As a result, he continues, the common people are made to pay through a strategy of fear by using a bogeyman like Hitler for World War II, communism for the Cold War, Osama bin Laden for the war on terror, or CO2 for the climate crisis. All these organized crime activities are executed through collaboration with traders in our, quote-unquote, our own governments and institutions. So long as only the corrupt mainstream media, pretty much all of which are owned by the Glavia or the monsters, so long as only these corrupt mainstream media existed, only very few people managed to understand these games. But the Internet changed this for the first time in history, beginning with 9/11, and now even more pronounced with COVID. Now we can find the now infamous French monster Jacques Attali and his essay, Change as a Precaution, on the Internet. It cannot be erased. In this article, he hoped that a pandemic would trigger a restructuring fear so that there would be a restructuring of society. He wrote, history teaches us that humanity only evolves significantly when it is truly afraid. The Internet, he continues, the Internet also shows that Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel admitted that he had foreknowledge of the pandemic, which thus becomes a plandemic, and that he produced the first vaccine batch in 2019. We also know, of course, that there were several exercises like Operation Dark Winter shortly before 9/11. 10 years later, in 2010, the Rockefellers' Lockstep exercise, and of course, in October of 2019, the now infamous Event 201. Because of all these anomalies, as Bayen calls this, including, of course, the fact that vaccines and viruses, or whatever it was, if it wasn't a virus, had been patented many years before the pandemic, the pharmaceutical industry had been able to produce these so-called vaccines long before they started the pandemic. The book also explains how already in March of 2020, Dr. John Ioannidis, one of the most influential and cited scientists ever, published an essay in which he argued against school closures, social distancing measures, and lockdowns. In April of 2020, he published an infection fatality rate of 0.17%, adjusted it to 0.15% in 2021, and that is just the same as a mild flu. And this confirmed the earlier expectations. His 2023 estimates are even significantly lower, he writes. And he continues, already in February of 2020, an elegant solution had presented itself. Call it serendipity or divine providence, but the Valley View Nursing Home in Toronto, Canada, had a scabies outbreak. 170 patients, but not the staff, were given ivermectin, a very safe and effective anti-parasitic drug in wide use for decades. Shortly thereafter, the home had a COVID-19 outbreak. The strange thing, however, was that staff became much more infected and sicker than the patients. The patients on the fourth floor, all very, very elderly people with comorbidities who had been treated for scabies with a therapeutic dose of ivermectin, had not even one clinical case of COVID. But strangely, the nursing home kept completely silent about this important natural trial, while the world's health authorities would have received its results with open arms, wouldn't they? Yet, When a relative of one of the patients brought this important news to the attention of the media and politicians, they decided to ignore it completely. The same happened with the equally effective treatment with hydroxychloroquine. The WHO actually prohibited its use. However, with this ignored and withheld and prohibited knowledge, the COVID outbreak, if there ever was one, and it wasn't just the flu, would have been managed by the worldwide application of early treatment based on hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and probably vitamin D and quercetin. And the COVID problem would have dissolved almost instantly. This has, in the meantime, been proven in numerous studies and also in the Amish communities of the USA. Instead, the bizarre policies enforced by, quote-unquote, our governments gave many of us an insight into the monster's eugenics policies, especially when instead of using the above-mentioned safe and effective medication, the monsters pushed, for example, deadly midazolam in the UK and remdesivir in the United States, plus very dangerous ventilators. However, the monsters lost the war right then and there, as their small window of opportunity had closed even then. Buy-in continues. In fact, GLAW's fanatic attempt to jab the whole population failed everywhere. In the Americas, Europe, and Japan, thanks to the many people who stood their ground. Official jab rates are clearly inflated, and the large control groups will at some point, I personally believe that this point is now, will at some point blow the lid off the cover-ups. There's also a very large control group in Africa, where only 6% were jabbed. Yet, Africa has fared much better in terms of COVID-ascribed mortalities than the other continents. Obviously, buy-in writes, the whole campaign was rolled out too early and too hurriedly, and a severe blowback may occur. Well, I think it is occurring already, hence the almost ridiculous panic amongst the monsters and their puppets. Buy-in asks, will the perpetrators be held accountable someday, or will the Ukraine war or other staged events be used to divert all attention from the carnage? My answer is no, it's too late. It's too late for any diversion. Too many of us are now seeing through their insane panic moves. Buy-in does see the positive effect of COVID. It has opened the eyes of many people to the ongoing global fraud, which has given important momentum to the truth movement. Now, a Canadian supporter tells me that none of the monsters' diversionary tactics are working any longer, not even in Canada. Already in January of 2024, a landmark decision from the federal court ruled that Trudeau's use of the Emergency Act to crush the Freedom Convoy was unconstitutional. That's groundbreaking. Immediately after that decision was released, a brave group of citizens who had their bank accounts frozen due to the use of the Emergency Act filed to sue the government, the banks, and key ministers personally for their involvement. That's just what I would have suggested to do. They are, for example, suing Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, along with the RCMP, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP Superintendent Baudouin, and the banks. The court decision is currently under appeal by the government. I don't know exactly what the current status is because I always, I get my mail a week or so after you sent it to me. But one of the leading figures behind the complaint for civil damages is not only confident that this appeal will not overturn the decision, but even if it did, it is absolutely clear that they still violated the Emergency Act by simply invoking it without going through any judicial proceeding. That is, by invoking it and freezing the bank accounts willfully and arbitrarily. And that is because right in the Act itself, it declares that it must operate pursuant to the Canadian Charter of Rights. But in this case, no police authority went through any judicial process or went before a judge to expose any reasonable grounds for freezing these bank accounts. I call this blatant authoritarianism and absolutely reckless disregard of the law. Now, whatever happens next, all of this, everything I have talked about so far in this statement is now out there. The people who know it cannot unknow it. The monsters who had been hoping to be able to use the internet to control us have no control over what is out there. And who has seen all this already? They don't know it. I find this extremely motivating, and it corresponds somehow with the slogan a French doctor sent me: shoot for the moon. Even if you miss it, you'll land in the stars. I call that a win-win proposition. And don't forget that all of this knowledge is out there despite the puppets of evil's best efforts to suppress it by denouncing all critics as right-wing radicals, conspiracy theorists, or anti-Semites. A woman from Australia sent me a copy of the publication New Dawn with an article by Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, an expert on heart disease. With lots of humor, he explains in his article titled The New Heretics, How Anti-Vaxxer Became a Weapon of Control, how they went about their tactic of utterly stupid defamation campaigns. And he quotes from Schopenhauer, yes, the Arthur Schopenhauer, from his essay, The Art of Being Right. In this essay, Schopenhauer discussed 38 ways to win an argument. For example, appeal to authority rather than reason, and bewilder your opponent by mere bombast. At number 38, become personal, insulting, rude, argumentum ad personam, which means attack the person. This, Kendrick says, is simply a way of stating about someone else that you are a disgusting person and no one should listen to anything you say ever again. Sounds childish, doesn't it? But in his article, Kendrick also reminds us that this very same Schopenhauer coined the sentence, first, it is ridiculed, second, it is violently opposed, third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Sounds a little or a lot like Gandhi's quote, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. That's where we are. In closing, allow me to tell you a few jokes that you sent me and that really made me laugh, sometimes very hard. Here's one. Trust science. Studies show that if your parents didn't have children, there's a high probability you won't either. Or this one. When the pool reopens due to social distancing rules, there will be no water in lanes 1, 3, and 5. Or here's a tip. Save business cards of people you don't like. If you hit a parked car accidentally, just write sorry on the back and leave it on the windshield. Or becoming an adult is the dumbest thing I've ever done. Or today's 3-year-olds can switch on laptops and open their favorite apps. When I was 3, I ate mud. Or one last one. People will stop asking you questions if you answer back in interpretive dance. All of these jokes came to me from an American who's been living in Australia with her husband for quite a while now. Let me close with 2 songs. One is They Don't Care About Us by Michael Jackson, who's really one of the greatest ever. And the other, which is the opposite, at least the title is, from Billy Ocean. It's When the Going Gets Tough, the Tough Get Going. So let's get going. You know, actions speak louder than words. I'll see you soon.